Power has a way of disguising itself as justice. A judge believed he had mastered that disguise until a single case tore it apart piece by piece. What followed was a revelation no one in the gallery expected, a moment that would echo far beyond the courtroom. To stay with us as we uncover stories that challenge authority, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and comment your thoughts on this plot, and let us know where you're watching from. Judge William Harrington's courtroom was notorious for its suffocating silence, a place where justice was wielded more like a hammer than a shield, and where every cough, shuffle, or whisper could be treated as insolence. On this morning, the air carried a weight of expectation, sunlight slicing through tall windows and painting narrow beams across the polished wooden benches, making the space feel more like a cage than a chamber of law. Harrington, a white judge who saw himself as the embodiment of order, sat high above the room in his leather chair, his robe draped over his shoulders like the cloak of a monarch. His gavel rested in his hand as if it were a scepter, and he used it as freely as any king used his sword. Across from him stood Elijah Brooks, a black man in his late 30s, tall, confident, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. His polished shoes reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and beside him rested a leather briefcase embossed with his initials, EB, in gold. Yet for Harrington, Elijah was not a man of presence or dignity, but just another black defendant who needed to be taught his place. Without glancing up from the papers in front of him, Harrington barked an insult that slashed through the silence. "Sit down. Are you deaf or just stupid?" His voice cracked like a whip, echoing off the marble walls, making the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. The words, cruel and unnecessary, hung in the air as if daring Elijah to resist. Elijah did not move. He stood tall, his dark eyes steady, his back straight, his expression calm, but unreadable. The stillness in him unsettled the judge, who slammed his gavel so violently that it thundered across the chamber. "I said sit down." Harrington snarled, his pale face reddening with irritation. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah lowered himself into the defendant's chair, his posture dignified, his composure unbroken. His briefcase gleamed at his side like a silent reminder of his identity, one no one in the room yet knew. Harrington's eyes gleamed with disdain as he looked Elijah over the rims of his glasses. "Typical," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Probably can't even read the charges against you." He read them out, not as a formality, but with theatrical venom: reckless endangerment, disturbing the peace, resisting arrest. They were charges that in any other courtroom might have been dismissed or resolved with a fine, but here, in Harrington's domain, they were painted as grave offenses. 60 days in the county jail, Harrington declared with the weight of finality. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before acting like you own the place." His gavel struck again, sealing the sentence like a brand. Murmurs swept the gallery, gasps muffled by hands, but no one dared rise to speak against the decision. They had seen this before, many times. A white judge flexing his power against a black defendant, cloaking prejudice in the language of law and order. Yet this time, it felt different. Elijah did not flinch. He did not plead. He did not bow his head. Instead, he placed his hands calmly on the table before him and kept his gaze forward, his expression calm as if he had anticipated this exact outcome. To the casual observer, he might have seemed resigned, but to those watching closely, his composure carried a quiet defiance, a refusal to break under Harrington's authority. For the judge, who was used to seeing fear, begging, or outrage, Elijah's silence was unnerving. Harrington had spent 15 years cultivating a reputation for being tough but fair, though everyone in the community understood what those words meant. Black defendants walked away with harsher sentences than white defendants charged with the same crimes. Black attorneys had their motions dismissed while their white colleagues received validation. Black families were shushed, warned, or threatened with expulsion for the slightest reaction, while white families laughed, sighed, and whispered freely. Yet Harrington always avoided overt language of racism. He was careful, precise, cunning. He never used slurs, never made direct statements that could be quoted against him. Instead, he wielded coded phrases and patronizing lectures about moral character and discipline, words sharpened into weapons that destroyed lives while preserving his own image. He was lauded in the papers as a man who believed in values, who kept his district peaceful. His colleagues at the country club praised him over glasses of scotch, saying he refused to bend to political correctness. The truth, whispered only in hallways and break rooms, was that his courtroom was a trap, one where being black meant being condemned from the moment you walked through the doors. Elijah knew this, though no one else in the room knew who he truly was. He had not come here to beg for mercy. He had come for something else entirely. The bailiffs moved toward him, ready to escort him out, but Elijah gave a faint nod, not of surrender, but of patience. For years, Judge William Harrington built his reputation on the image of a stern but principled man of the law, yet beneath the surface his philosophy was little more than prejudice disguised as order, and those who appeared before him soon learned that being black in his courtroom meant harsher sentences, colder words, and fewer chances at redemption. After humiliating Elijah Brooks and slamming down the gavel with a 60-day jail sentence for what should have been nothing more than a minor violation, Harrington leaned back in his chair, convinced he had once again shown the community that he would not be challenged. But what he did not realize was that this case would be remembered not for his authority, but for the unveiling of his long-hidden pattern. Lawyers whispered in corridors about his double standards, yet few dared to speak openly, because Harrington wielded more than the gavel. He controlled careers, cases, and reputations, and anyone who crossed him risked professional ruin. He always dressed his bias in the language of discipline and values, telling new clerks that justice was not about feelings but about maintaining the natural order of society, which in practice meant white defendants walked away with probation, while black defendants were shackled with prison terms for the same offenses. His favorite tactic was to emphasize background and associations during sentencing, pausing long enough on that word associations to make clear, without saying it, that he meant race and community, and those pauses carried more weight than slurs ever could, because they were carefully calculated to influence perception while remaining invisible to oversight boards. When a young black attorney named Monica James raised an objection during a domestic violence hearing, Harrington dismissed her with surgical precision, condescending that she ought to focus on proper courtroom procedure before trying to lecture the court, while 15 minutes later, her white colleague made the identical objection and was praised for his insight. The contrast was so blatant that those in attendance exchanged glances, but no one spoke up, for everyone knew speaking up would bring retaliation. Public defenders carried the scars of his rulings, describing in hushed tones how their black clients always received sentences 30 to 40% longer than white clients with identical records. Families in the gallery had their voices silenced. Black mothers warned against gasping or murmuring, while white families wept openly without consequence. Court reporters quietly requested transfers rather than continue enduring the heavy atmosphere of Harrington's chambers, and still the judge's career advanced, his reputation polished by glowing media profiles that praised his toughness on crime and his unwillingness to yield to changing social winds. Newspapers described him as a man of strong values, while at the country club he was celebrated for keeping the district quiet, though the quiet came not from fairness but from fear. It was a silence born from intimidation, from families who no longer believed the system could protect them, from attorneys who avoided cases that landed in his courtroom, from communities that saw justice as nothing more than another weapon pointed against them. Harrington never faltered in this performance, always careful to appear professional, never using overtly racist language, never offering sound bites that could be turned against him. Instead, he wielded respectability politics like a scalpel, cutting down defendants and attorneys alike, with phrases about moral foundations and character flaws. A white defendant might be described as a promising young man who made a poor choice, while a black defendant facing the same charge would be declared a threat who lacked the discipline for rehabilitation. These patterns were not isolated, they were consistent, year after year, case after case. And though defense attorneys knew the truth, they also knew the futility of challenging him, because appeals rarely succeeded and oversight complaints vanished into bureaucratic black holes. Harrington built his empire on the certainty that no one would dare collect the evidence, no one would risk their livelihood to expose him, no one would shine a light on the disparities that were so obvious to those who lived them, but invisible to those who benefited from them. Yet his confidence was misplaced, because sitting silently at the defendant's table only hours earlier had been Elijah Brooks, a black man who was not merely a victim but the state's lead prosecutor, and Elijah had come prepared not only with dignity, but with knowledge of Harrington's history. Elijah had studied the judge's methods, tracked the patterns, and assembled the data that could prove what so many had only whispered. Harrington believed the humiliation of a single black defendant reinforced his power, but in reality, it marked the beginning of his undoing, because for the first time, the pattern would be laid bare by someone with both the resources and the determination to bring it to light. Harrington's career had been a careful construction, a monument to the illusion of fairness, but the cracks were spreading. The Jefferson case, where a young black college graduate was given 2 years for a minor drug possession while a white man with the identical charge walked away with probation, lingered in the memory of attorneys and families alike. The Washington case, where a teenager received prison for marijuana possession while his white counterpart was diverted to rehab, still angered public defenders. The sentence Harrington delivered to Elijah Brooks had been just one more in a long line of injustices, a single note in a symphony of double standards that stretched back through his entire career, and though the gallery left the courtroom that morning with quiet resignation, the memory of countless other cases lingered in their minds like scars that never healed. Harrington's philosophy had always been to cloak discrimination beneath a veneer of judicial order, and it was in the comparisons between black and white defendants that his prejudice was clearest. Months earlier, Jamal Turner, a 23-year-old black college graduate with no prior record, had been caught during a traffic stop with a small amount of cocaine. The prosecutor recommended probation and community service, a fair resolution for a first offense, but Harrington seized the moment to deliver a lecture that echoed across the packed courtroom. He told Jamal that he had squandered his opportunities, that people from his community preferred the easy path of crime, and that perhaps 2 years in state prison would provide the discipline he had clearly lacked at home. The gavel fell with finality, and Jamal's mother gasped in disbelief only to be threatened with removal for disrupting the court. That same week, Ethan Collins, a white man the same age, was charged with possession of the same amount of cocaine under nearly identical circumstances. The same prosecutor recommended probation, and this time Harrington nodded gravely, telling Collins that youthful mistakes were unfortunate but understandable, and that 6 months probation, community service, and mandatory counseling would give him the chance to rebuild his life. The contrast was staggering, yet no one dared challenge it because Harrington's authority was ironclad. He framed his decisions as reflections of character, not race, but everyone in the room knew the truth. The double standards played out over and over, each ruling a reminder of how stacked the system was. Black families who sat in the gallery saw their sons, brothers, and fathers condemned with harsh words about moral failure, while white families were comforted with reassurances about temporary lapses in judgment. The same acts produced entirely different outcomes depending on skin color, and though attorneys whispered among themselves about the blatant disparities, appeals rarely succeeded. Harrington's sentences were almost never overturned because higher courts deferred to his judicial discretion and oversight boards dismissed complaints without action. The imbalance was not just in the outcomes but in the way Harrington carried himself, treating black attorneys as nuisances while granting their white colleagues respect. Monica James still remembered the sting of having her objection dismissed with condescension, while her white counterpart was thanked for making the same point minutes later. Court reporters and clerks whispered to each other about his pauses, about the way he used words like associations and discipline as coded weapons, and about how families of color were always warned to stay quiet while white families were free to react. The consequences of these double standards rippled through entire communities. Young black men emerged from his courtroom branded as criminals, their lives altered irreparably, while white men left with probation or diversion programs, their records intact, their futures preserved. Public defenders grew weary of fighting uphill battles in his courtroom, advising black clients to accept plea deals rather than risk facing his bias at trial. The pattern was so well known that families dreaded having their cases land in his docket, and some attorneys quietly pulled away from practicing in his district altogether. The trust that was supposed to form the foundation of the justice system had been eroded, leaving behind cynicism and despair. Yet Harrington remained untouchable, his reputation polished by glowing newspaper articles that described him as tough on crime, strong on values, a judge who kept his district safe. At country clubs and conferences, he was celebrated for refusing to bend to what his peers derided as political correctness. Even as stories of unfair treatment circulated, he seemed invincible, shielded by the very system he manipulated. But beneath that polished exterior, the evidence of his prejudice mounted, hidden in files, whispered in corridors, and carried silently by the lives he had broken. For Elijah Brooks, the sentence he had just received was not an isolated act of cruelty, but the final puzzle piece in a broader pattern he had been documenting for months. Sitting in his office across from the courthouse, he had charted case after case, lining up black and white defendants charged with identical crimes, only to find sentencing gaps of 30, 40, sometimes 60%. He had pulled examples like Jamal and Ethan, like the Washington case where a black teenager received prison time for marijuana possession while a white teenager received rehab, like the Jefferson case where college graduation was used against the black defendant as proof of wasted opportunity, but in a white defendant would have been cited as evidence of potential. Elijah had collected these disparities not as anecdotes but as evidence, numbers on spreadsheets, files in boxes, stories that together painted a picture no one could ignore. Harrington thought he was delivering order, but what he was really building was a pattern of systemic injustice, one Elijah was now prepared to expose. Every insult Harrington hurled, every dismissive remark to a black attorney, every disproportionate sentence, every warning to a black family in the gallery was part of a record Elijah was assembling with the precision of a surgeon. What made Elijah's strategy so powerful was that it was grounded not just in numbers but in lived experience. By placing himself before Harrington as a defendant, by accepting the humiliation and the harsh sentence, Elijah had allowed the judge to reveal his true nature once again. It was one more example to add to the collection, one more piece of undeniable evidence to show that the pattern was not speculation, not perception, but reality. Harrington had just given Elijah the proof he needed, and though the judge believed he had reinforced his authority, he had in fact signed the first page of his own downfall. The double standards were no longer whispers or rumors. They were documented, organized, and soon to be revealed with devastating clarity. The silence Harrington had cultivated was about to be shattered, and for the first time in 15 years, the walls of his courtroom would no longer protect him. Among them was Anna Ruiz, a former court clerk who had seen firsthand how Harrington operated behind closed doors, and while to the public he was the image of dignity, in his chambers he allowed his prejudices to flow freely, mocking defendants, belittling black attorneys, and boasting about how he controlled the district with an iron fist. Anna, weary of being complicit, began documenting everything, writing notes after each private conference, and when Harrington once berated her for being too friendly with black attorneys, she realized silence was no longer possible, so she bought a small recorder and began capturing his private words. At first it was fragments, casual remarks dripping with disdain, offhand comments about how these people needed to learn discipline, but soon the recordings grew into a damning archive, hours of conversations where Harrington revealed his true nature without the mask he wore in public. These recordings would eventually fall into Elijah's hands, but at this moment they remained locked away, a hidden crack waiting to widen. Harrington continued to enjoy the adoration of his peers, the praise of the press, and the comfort of the country club where he was toasted as a defender of order. Newspaper headlines painted him as a symbol of fairness, a judge who upheld traditional values, and his name began circulating as a candidate for promotion to the state appellate court. For many, his elevation seemed inevitable, and he accepted the congratulations with smug satisfaction, believing his career path was secure. Yet beneath the surface his empire was beginning to erode, though he was blind to it. Court reporters were requesting transfers, public defenders were quietly shifting cases away from his courtroom, and families in the community spoke in hushed voices about his unfairness. The facade remained, but beneath it resentment and evidence were accumulating. For Elijah, the existence of people like Anna Ruiz was vital. While he built his case through numbers and statistics, he knew data alone lacked the emotional impact to break through the walls of denial. People would argue numbers, dismiss them as coincidence or interpretation, but words spoken directly from Harrington's mouth could not be ignored. Elijah needed both, and as he spent late nights in his office compiling records, he thought often of the young black law student who had met his gaze in the courtroom after his sentence, realizing that inspiration required proof, and proof required courage. Harrington's arrogance had created enemies even among those tasked with serving him, and their silent resistance would soon converge with Elijah's strategy into something unstoppable. Meanwhile, Harrington strutted through the courthouse as though untouchable. He believed his methods would never be exposed because he had mastered the art of coded language, never uttering overtly racist statements on the record, always cloaking bias in the language of discipline and morality. He trusted that oversight boards would dismiss complaints as unfounded, that appeals courts would defer to his discretion, and that colleagues would nod approvingly at his toughness. Yet he underestimated the quiet accumulation of cracks behind the curtain. Every family he had silenced carried their story. Every attorney he had belittled carried resentment. Every staff member who endured his arrogance carried memories, and all of it was being collected. The Jefferson case continued to haunt the community, where a promising black graduate had been condemned while a white counterpart walked free, and in neighborhood meetings, people whispered about how the system had failed them again. The Washington case, where a teenager was imprisoned while his white peer went to rehab, was discussed in barbershops and churches as evidence of injustice. These stories spread, not through official channels but through word of mouth, weaving into the collective memory of the community. For Harrington, they were minor victories, proof that he had maintained order, but for Elijah, they were the human face of the statistics he was compiling, the flesh and blood behind the numbers, the reason why his plan could not fail. The promotion Harrington sought became a catalyst for Elijah's urgency. If Harrington reached the appellate court, his power would expand beyond one courtroom, shaping decisions across the state, and the damage would multiply. Elijah knew the clock was ticking, and the facade of the judge's respectability had to be shattered before the nomination was finalized. The recordings Ana Ruiz had risked her career to capture, the spreadsheets Elijah had compiled, and the testimonies of families who had been silenced would form the arsenal that could bring Harrington down. But Elijah understood that evidence alone would not be enough. He needed something undeniable, something that would unfold before the eyes of the public, so they could see the bias as clearly as the numbers proved it. That was why he had chosen to place himself in Harrington's hands, why he had endured the humiliation of a public sentence, why he had stared back at the judge with calm defiance. It was a gamble, but it was also a necessity. Behind the curtain of Harrington's public image, the cracks were widening. Ana Ruiz carried recordings in her purse like dangerous contraband. Elijah filled his office with boxes of files that told a story of systemic bias. Families shared stories in whispers that burned like coals waiting for air, and colleagues who once praised Harrington began to sense that his time was running out. Harrington, smug and oblivious, continued to wield his gavel as though it were unbreakable, unaware that every strike was echoing not as proof of his authority, but as evidence of his downfall. The cracks behind Judge William Harrington's curtain of respectability widened with each whispered story, each hidden recording, each spreadsheet filled with disparities. But what no one in the courtroom had realized during Elijah Brooks's sentencing was that the man they saw as another unlucky black defendant was in truth the state's most formidable prosecutor, a man whose entire career had been built on exposing corruption and defending civil rights. And while Harrington believed he had humiliated him with a 60-day jail sentence, Elijah had been quietly orchestrating the moment for months. After leaving the courtroom, Elijah did not slink away in shame. Instead, he walked with measured calm to his office across the street, a place that had become less a workplace and more a war room, its walls lined with charts, graphs, and bankers' boxes filled with 15 years of case records. Every file told the same story: harsher sentences for black defendants, leniency for white ones, dismissal for black attorneys, praise for their white counterparts, warnings for black families, indulgence for white families. Harrington had built his reputation on the illusion of fairness, but Elijah had built a mountain of proof showing that illusion for what it truly was. The moment he sat down at his desk, the phone buzzed with updates. His deputy, Sarah Lopez, had stayed late organizing the Jefferson files, creating side-by-side comparisons that were impossible to ignore. Jamal Turner's 2-year sentence stood in stark contrast to Ethan Collins's probation, and the documentation was meticulous. Elijah's statistical team had completed their analysis as well, confirming what Elijah already knew. Black defendants in Harrington's courtroom received sentences on average 42% harsher than white defendants with identical charges and histories, sometimes climbing to more than 60%. It was not coincidence. It was not unconscious bias. It was methodical, deliberate, and consistent. Elijah leaned back in his chair and stared at the wall of evidence. feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. For years, colleagues had whispered about Harrington's bias, but whispers could not topple a judge. Only undeniable proof could, and Elijah had chosen to provide that proof himself. He had walked into Harrington's courtroom as bait, knowing the judge would seize the opportunity to flex his authority, knowing the sentence would be harsher than the crime justified, and knowing that the entire exchange would become the final piece of evidence in a case that stretched back more than a decade. But Elijah was not acting alone. His office had become the hub of a growing network of allies, each contributing a piece of the puzzle. Ana Ruiz's recordings were stored securely in a locked cabinet, and Elijah had listened to them late into the night, hearing Harrington's voice dripping with disdain, mocking black defendants, belittling black attorneys, and bragging about how he kept order by keeping those people in line. The words were shocking not because they were unexpected, but because they stripped away the careful mask Harrington wore in public. For Elijah, the recordings were gold, not only because they captured the judge's intent, but because they matched perfectly with the statistical evidence, creating a narrative that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Still, Elijah knew numbers and recordings would not be enough. The public needed a story, a moment they could see with their own eyes, a demonstration of bias so undeniable that even Harrington's allies could not spin it away. That was why Elijah had chosen to sit at the defendant's table, why he had endured the insult of being called stupid, why he had accepted the humiliation of a sentence he did not deserve. It was calculated sacrifice, a strategy born from years of watching others suffer without recourse. In his office, Elijah spread open a red folder marked "Personal Impact." Inside were letters from families who had lived through Harrington's courtroom. One was from Mrs. Jefferson, who wrote that the judge had looked at her son like he was garbage, sentencing him to 2 years in prison for the same amount of marijuana a white boy carried home with probation. Another was from Tony Washington, a veteran public defender who had watched client after client receive disproportionate sentences while his white counterparts walked free. Elijah read these letters again, his jaw tightening, reminding himself why this fight mattered. These were not just statistics. They were lives shattered, families broken, futures destroyed. He could not fail them. He would not fail them. As he stared out his office window at the courthouse across the street, Elijah thought of Harrington sitting smugly in his chambers, believing his promotion to the appellate bench was inevitable, believing his power was unassailable. From Elijah's vantage point, he could see the judge's window on the 4th floor, the blinds half drawn, the light glowing faintly. It was a reminder of the man's arrogance, of the fortress of authority he believed protected him. But Elijah knew better. Fortresses crumble when the foundation rots, and Harrington's foundation was nothing but bias stacked on prejudice. The mountain of evidence Elijah had compiled would expose it all. The challenge lay not in the evidence itself, but in the delivery. Harrington had powerful friends in politics, allies who toasted him at the country club, senators who praised his values, newspapers that painted him as the model judge. To bring him down, Elijah needed timing, precision, and courage. The appellate nomination hearing was days away, and if Harrington ascended before the evidence was revealed, his influence would only grow stronger. Elijah checked his calendar. Thursday morning, his brother Michael's hearing on a traffic stop that had already been twisted into a resisting arrest charge. Thursday afternoon, the appellate committee's meeting. The overlap was perfect. Elijah would use Michael's case as a template, orchestrating his own confrontation in Harrington's courtroom to provide the last piece of proof. He had already arranged for his arrest, already coordinated with allies who would remain silent until the right moment. It was dangerous, even reckless, but it was necessary. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from Patricia Hayes, an old friend from law school who now sat as a circuit judge. The message was simple. Be careful. He has friends, but you are right to fight. Elijah allowed himself a small smile. Not everyone was blind to Harrington's corruption. Some judges, some prosecutors, some attorneys quietly hoped for his downfall, but feared to act. Elijah's plan gave them a chance to see justice in motion, to witness a reckoning 15 years in the making. Elijah Brooks had revealed himself in truth only to his closest circle, and while the outside world still saw him as just another black defendant caught in Judge William Harrington's net, inside his office across the street the reality had already shifted. Because Elijah had made the decision to take on the most dangerous plan of his career, one that would require him to place his life, his career, and his reputation on the line in order to destroy a judge who had spent 15 years destroying the lives of others. The files were stacked high on his desk, each one a life, a family, a record of disparity, but Elijah understood that statistics, recordings, and testimonies could only go so far. He needed a demonstration in real time, an undeniable example that showed the world exactly how Harrington operated when he believed no one could touch him. To achieve that, Elijah was willing to sacrifice himself. His colleague and longtime friend Andre Miller stormed into his office when Elijah first revealed the plan, disbelief written all over his face. "You're telling me you deliberately put yourself in Harrington's courtroom as a defendant? Elijah, that's insane. If this goes wrong, you don't just lose your case, you lose your badge, your entire career." Elijah remained calm, his voice steady, his resolve unshakable. "If I don't do this, Andre, how many more Jamals and Maliks will sit at that table? How many more black families will leave that courtroom broken? If I have to endure what they endure to prove the pattern, then that's what I'll do. It's not about my career. It's about justice." Andre shook his head, pacing the room, reminding Elijah that Harrington had allies, that powerful people wanted his promotion to the appellate court, that stepping into the fire could burn them both. But Elijah only leaned forward, tapping the files with his finger. "The difference is, this time the defendant has power. This time the defendant has access, resources, and a voice the system cannot silence. Harrington thinks he humiliated me, but he handed me the final piece of evidence. The plan itself was as precise as it was dangerous." Elijah had studied Harrington long enough to know the judge's patterns, the way he inflated minor charges for black defendants into jail time, the way he used his discretion to impose harsher penalties while giving leniency to whites. Elijah intended to orchestrate a scenario where he himself would be arrested under similar circumstances, a minor traffic violation twisted into resisting arrest or disorderly conduct, the kind of charge Harrington loved to elevate. It was a gamble because if Harrington sensed anything unusual, the entire plan could collapse. But Elijah believed in the judge's arrogance, in his predictable reliance on bias, and he was willing to bet his future that Harrington would once again reveal himself. To keep the plan airtight, Elijah limited knowledge of it to a handful of trusted allies. Andre was furious but swore he would remain silent, knowing the fewer people aware, the better. Elijah's deputy Sarah Lopez was told only what she needed to know, that if anything happened to him, she was to step into his role as acting lead prosecutor and move forward with the evidence. At home, Elijah carried the burden quietly. His wife sensed the weight pressing on him, the long hours, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, but she knew better than to push. When she finally asked him if it was worth risking everything, Elijah answered with the memory of his younger brother Michael's traffic stop, how an officer had inflated a speeding ticket into allegations of aggressive behavior, how Harrington's court had jurisdiction over the case, how Michael's spotless record and professional success had not shielded him from being cast as a dangerous black man. "If it can happen to Michael, it can happen to anyone," Elijah told her, his voice thick with resolve. "I won't stand by and watch another generation get crushed under his gavel." Elijah also knew timing was everything. Harrington's appellate nomination hearing was scheduled within days of Michael's case, and Elijah recognized the opportunity. If he could engineer his own arrest and appear in Harrington's courtroom before the nomination hearing, he could expose the bias in real time while simultaneously presenting the mountain of evidence he had gathered. It would be the perfect storm: statistics, recordings, testimonies, and a live demonstration that could not be ignored. Yet even as Elijah planned, doubts lingered at the edges. What if Harrington recognized him too soon? What if the federal board dismissed the evidence as entrapment? What if his allies wavered under pressure? But each doubt was silenced by the memory of Jamal Turner's face when the gavel fell, by the sound of Malik Jefferson's mother gasping in disbelief, by the letters from families begging for someone to see them, to hear them, to fight for them. Elijah knew the cost of doing nothing was greater than any risk he faced. Late one evening, Elijah received a call from Judge Patricia Hayes, a respected colleague from his Harvard days. She spoke in hushed tones, warning that Harrington's name had already been whispered at judicial conferences, that unusual records requests tied to Elijah's office had not gone unnoticed, that if he was building a case, he needed to be careful. Elijah did not deny it, though he framed his answer as hypothetical. Patricia's voice was steady, filled with both caution and support. If someone were exposing systematic bias at the level you're describing, they'd have my full backing, she said. But Elijah, Harrington has powerful friends. Don't underestimate how far they'll go to protect him. Elijah thanked her, his conviction deepening rather than wavering. He knew the risks, but he also knew he was not alone. The next day, Elijah met with his statistical expert, Dr. Carolyn Foster, who confirmed that the disparities were unlike anything she had ever seen. "I've analyzed judicial data for 30 years, she said, her finger tracing the red lines of graphs spread across the table. "I've never encountered gaps this severe. This isn't bias, Elijah. This is a system within a system, engineered by one man who knows exactly what he's doing." Her words only fueled his determination. He instructed her to prepare testimony, to be ready when the time came, to make sure the numbers told the story as clearly as the recordings did. Meanwhile, Elijah coordinated quietly with Danny Rodriguez, a security officer who had known him for years, arranging the logistics of the arrest that would bring him back into Harrington's courtroom under controlled circumstances. It was delicate work, requiring absolute secrecy, because if word leaked, Harrington might alter his behavior, and the demonstration would fail. Elijah stressed the importance of authenticity, of letting Harrington believe he had full control, because the judge's arrogance was the trap itself. Each night, Elijah returned to his files, reviewing every detail, refining every angle, preparing himself for the confrontation. He imagined Harrington's face when the mask slipped, when the evidence was unveiled, when the courtroom turned against him. He knew it would not erase the pain of those already sentenced, but it would prevent countless others from suffering the same fate. He also knew it would send a message beyond Harrington's courtroom, a warning to every judge who wielded prejudice under the cover of discretion. The days of impunity were ending. Elijah Brooks had stepped fully into the danger of his plan, understanding that one misstep could cost him his career or his freedom, but he also knew that no great fight was won alone, and in the days that followed, he relied on a network of allies who worked quietly behind the scenes, each contributing something vital to the operation that would finally expose Judge William Harrington. His office, once simply a place where prosecutors reviewed case files and prepared motions, now looked more like the headquarters of a resistance movement, with charts covering walls, bankers' boxes lining hallways, and folders stacked on every available surface. Inside those boxes were lives, proof that Harrington had turned justice into a weapon, but Elijah was not the only one who had taken notice. Dr. Carolyn Foster, a nationally recognized statistician who had spent 3 decades analyzing judicial patterns, had been running numbers late into the night, double and triple checking her work because even she could not believe the disparities at first. When Elijah met her in a dimly lit conference room, she spread out her charts across the long wooden table like an architect laying blueprints for a new building. "I've run the analysis 4 different ways," she said, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "There's no margin of error large enough to explain this away. Black defendants in Harrington's courtroom are sentenced to terms 42% longer than white defendants with identical records. In some categories, the gap climbs to over 60%. Elijah, this is not unconscious bias. This is systematic, intentional discrimination." Elijah nodded, his jaw tight, his mind already spinning through the implications. He had expected numbers to back up the stories, but the scale was staggering even for him. He thought of Jamal Turner and Malik Jefferson, of the families who had written letters begging for justice, and he knew these numbers were the weapon that could not be ignored. Foster wasn't finished. She pulled out another set of documents, this time transcripts of interviews she had conducted with public defenders across the district. "They all say the same thing," she explained. "Harrington's plea conferences are hostile toward black defendants, so hostile that attorneys advise their clients to reject deals and risk trial because the alternative is worse. Black defendants are 38% more likely to go to trial here than in any other district, and the outcomes are consistently harsher. This isn't just sentencing disparity, it's a pattern designed to funnel black defendants into prison." Elijah leaned back, the weight of the data heavy on his shoulders, but it was a burden he welcomed. "Thank you, Carolyn," he said. "This will be the backbone of our case. Numbers don't lie, and when combined with testimony and recordings, they'll be impossible to dismiss." Recordings. The word carried a sharper edge than statistics because while numbers were powerful, voices were undeniable. Anna Ruiz, Harrington's former clerk, had been meeting with Elijah under cover of secrecy, terrified of retaliation, but determined to see the truth come out. She had carried a recorder in her purse for months, capturing snippets of chamber conversations that revealed the judge's casual racism, his contempt for black families, his deliberate manipulation of sentencing schedules. One recording in particular chilled Elijah to the bone. Harrington telling his clerk to schedule Malik Jefferson's sentencing for a Thursday afternoon so the young man would sit in jail over the weekend before being shipped upstate. "I want him to think about his choices," Harrington said on tape, his voice dripping with cruelty. Malik's crime had been possession of a small amount of cocaine, a case that should have ended with probation, yet Harrington wanted him to suffer not only through prison, but through the petty indignity of extra days in a cell. Anna's collection amounted to 47 hours of recordings, and she handed them to Elijah with trembling hands. "I'm scared," she admitted. "He's destroyed people before, ruined their careers, pushed them out of the system, but I can't carry this anymore. He needs to be stopped." Elijah placed a hand over hers, steadying her. "You've done more than you know, Anna. These recordings will make the difference. You're not alone in this anymore." As the evidence grew, so did the network of quiet supporters. Andre Miller, though furious at Elijah's willingness to risk his career, had come around, helping connect him with defense attorneys who had long suspected Harrington's bias but had never had the platform to speak. Sarah Lopez, Elijah's trusted deputy, cleared her calendar entirely, taking over routine duties so Elijah could focus on the case. Even Danny Rodriguez, the courthouse security guard who had known Elijah for years, became a silent ally, passing along tidbits of information about Harrington's schedule, his meetings, his moods, the little details that might prove useful when the trap was sprung. These allies operated in shadows, careful not to draw attention, but their combined efforts created a foundation as strong as any case Elijah had ever built. Meanwhile, Harrington celebrated his looming promotion. At the country club, he accepted congratulations with smug smiles, raising glasses of expensive whiskey, while senators and senior attorneys praised his toughness. He had no idea that while he toasted to his future, files were being copied, charts were being prepared, recordings were being cataloged, and allies were quietly assembling against him. His arrogance blinded him to the cracks forming in his empire, and Elijah counted on that blindness. But the danger was real. Every step Elijah took tightened the rope around his own neck. If Harrington's allies discovered the plan, they would brand it entrapment, accuse Elijah of misconduct, strip him of his position. That was why he limited knowledge, why even among his allies, each person knew only part of the larger strategy. Andre knew about the arrest, but not about the recordings. Carolyn knew about the statistics, but not about Elijah's staged sentencing. Anna knew about her tapes, but not about the broader federal interest building around the case. The plan's strength lay in its secrecy, and Elijah bore the full weight of knowledge alone. Late at night, he sat in his office, staring at the wall of evidence, feeling the enormity of what lay ahead. He thought of his brother Michael, pulled over for a fabricated traffic violation, his career and reputation nearly tarnished by one biased report. He thought of his own sentencing days earlier, the insults, the gavel, the cold certainty with which Harrington believed he had put another black man in his place. Those moments fueled him, reminding him that his risk was not reckless, but necessary. The allies gathering in the shadows gave him hope, but his resolve came from something deeper, from the knowledge that justice demanded sacrifice, and he was willing to be that sacrifice. The allies had gathered in silence, each one providing their part of the foundation, but Elijah Brooks knew that the strength of data and recordings alone would not break through the walls Judge William Harrington had built around himself. What would shatter them was a live demonstration in Harrington's own arena, a moment so undeniable that even the most powerful allies of the judge would be left speechless. The day of Elijah's return to the courtroom arrived with a sense of gravity that could not be mistaken. Outside, storm clouds hung heavy over the city, as though the skies themselves anticipated a reckoning, and inside the courthouse, every corridor buzzed with the usual shuffle of clerks, attorneys, and defendants, none of them aware that history was about to unfold within those marble walls. Harrington took the bench that morning with his usual arrogance, unaware that he was walking into the final trap of his career. He still saw Elijah as nothing more than the defendant he had sentenced to 60 days, still blind to the truth that Elijah was the state's lead prosecutor, still convinced that his authority could not be challenged. He wasted no time in flexing that authority again, barking orders, waving aside objections, treating each case as another opportunity to display his control. When Elijah's name was called, the murmurs in the gallery grew louder, because many recognized the well-dressed black man who had kept his composure during his humiliating sentence only days earlier. Harrington narrowed his eyes, his gavel slamming down as he reminded the room of order. 60 days in county jail stands, he announced, his voice dripping with disdain. Another example of a man who thinks he's above the law. The bailiffs moved toward Elijah, expecting compliance, expecting the submissive resignation Harrington had drilled into countless defendants. But this time Elijah did not move. Instead, he clasped his hands behind his back and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of a man who had commanded courtrooms for 15 years. "Your Honor, I request permission to address the court." Harrington's face flushed crimson, the insult of defiance igniting fury in his chest. "This matter is closed," he snapped. "Bailiff, remove him immediately." Yet the bailiff hesitated, for something in Elijah's tone made him pause, as if instinctively recognizing authority greater than the judge's. Elijah's next words cut through the air like a blade. "I am Elijah Brooks, lead prosecutor for the state of Georgia, Special Crimes Division." The gallery erupted. Gasps filled the room, attorneys whispered frantically, reporters scrambled for their phones, and even Harrington's clerk froze mid-motion, her pen suspended above paper. Harrington blinked, his face draining of color. "What did you say?" he stammered. Elijah reached into his jacket and withdrew his official credentials, holding the gold badge high so that everyone could see. "Elijah Brooks, lead prosecutor, badge number 27,491, 15 years in service. And this morning, Your Honor, you provided the final proof of what I have spent months documenting, systematic bias in your courtroom." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the rustle of reporters snapping photos and attorneys whispering in disbelief. Harrington gripped the edge of his bench, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, struggling to reclaim the authority slipping from his hands. "This is some kind of trick," he said hoarsely. "You can't, this is irregular, this is misconduct." Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm, his presence commanding. "What you call irregular, I call justice. Every insult you hurled, every assumption you made about me based on the color of my skin, every ounce of bias you displayed is all part of the official record now." He set his briefcase on the defendant's table, opening it to reveal stacks of organized files. "For 6 months, I have been conducting an official investigation into your courtroom, compiling data, testimonies, and recordings. Today's proceedings provided the final piece. This case is complete." The courtroom was electric. Some attorneys cheered quietly under their breath, others sat frozen in awe. Harrington struggled to steady himself, attempting to regain control. "This is highly irregular," he repeated, trying to mask the panic creeping into his voice. "You cannot ambush a sitting judge in his own courtroom. Bailiff, I command you to clear this courtroom immediately." Yet the bailiff did not move. His eyes lingered on Elijah's credentials, on the badge that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, on the authority it represented. "Your Honor," Elijah said firmly, "you no longer command this courtroom. As of this moment, you are under investigation by the State Judicial Board, the Federal Civil Rights Division, and the Attorney General's Office for violations of constitutional rights." Gasps turned into shouts as reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing, their recorders thrust out to capture every word. Harrington's hands shook visibly as he clutched his gavel, which now felt more like dead weight than a weapon of power. You entrapped me," he croaked, desperation seeping through. Elijah's reply was cold and precise. "Entrapment requires persuading someone to commit an act they otherwise would not. You, Judge Harrington, have been committing these acts for 15 years. I did not entrap you. I exposed you." He turned toward the gallery, his voice rising so all could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, my name is Elijah Brooks, and I have served as lead prosecutor in this state for over a decade. This morning I placed myself at this table not to seek leniency, but to prove what has long been whispered but never demonstrated so clearly, that in this courtroom justice is not blind, that defendants are judged not by evidence but by race, and that one man's prejudice has poisoned the system for years. Today that ends. The gallery erupted into a roar, attorneys pounding their desks in support, reporters speaking into cameras as they broadcast the unfolding scandal live. Harrington's face twisted in rage and fear, his hand trembling as the gavel slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the marble floor. The sound reverberated through the chamber like a death knell. Elijah closed his briefcase and stood tall, his calm presence in stark contrast to Harrington's collapse. "This courtroom is no longer yours to command," he declared. "It belongs to the people, and they deserve justice." The moment Elijah Brooks revealed his identity as the state's lead prosecutor, the courtroom transformed from a chamber of silence into a crucible of chaos, with reporters scrambling for their phones, attorneys whispering to one another in disbelief, and members of the gallery gasping loudly as if history itself had just shifted before their eyes. But at the center of it all stood Judge William Harrington, his face drained of color, his authority slipping through his trembling hands, his gavel clattering to the marble floor like a broken symbol of power. Elijah did not waver. He opened his briefcase, pulling out file after file, laying them out on the table with deliberate care, each one a case that told the same story of bias and disparity. "For 15 years, he said, his voice steady and resonant, this courtroom has been used not as a place of justice, but as a stage for prejudice. Here are the records, the comparisons, the proof." He held up 2 files, one for Jamal Turner, who had received 2 years in prison for a first offense of possession, and one for Ethan Collins, a white defendant who had been granted probation for the same crime. "This is not justice. This is discrimination." The gallery erupted again, voices rising in outrage, reporters snapping photos of the files as Elijah laid them out like evidence in a murder trial. Harrington tried to speak, his voice shaking. "This is misconduct, Brooks. This is entrapment. You have no right to bring these accusations in my courtroom." Elijah looked directly at him, his dark eyes unwavering. "Entrapment? No, Judge Harrington. Entrapment is tricking someone into doing what they would never do. I did not trick you. I gave you the chance to be fair, and you chose to be biased, just as you always have. Today the mask slipped. Today the world sees you for who you are." From the back of the courtroom a door opened, and in walked federal agents accompanied by Assistant Attorney General Karen Webb, their presence amplifying the gravity of the moment. Agent Monica Rodriguez, her badge glinting, stepped forward with a document in hand. "Judge William Harrington, by the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice, you are hereby charged with conspiracy to deprive persons of their civil rights under color of law, violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 242. The words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Harrington stumbled back in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his voice faltering. "This is madness. I am a sitting judge. You can't do this in my courtroom." Elijah took a step closer, his voice cold and resolute. "It's no longer your courtroom, Harrington. Your power ended the moment you let your prejudice dictate justice once again." He lifted a small digital recorder from his briefcase and pressed play. The room filled with Harrington's own voice, mocking black defendants, speaking of discipline and order, telling his clerk to schedule sentences in ways that inflicted maximum suffering. The gallery listened in horrified silence, every word another nail in Harrington's coffin. Even his own clerk looked on in shock, realizing that the man she had served was being unmasked in front of the world. Harrington's lawyer, a seasoned man named Robert Harrison, rose shakily from his seat, attempting to salvage the moment. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Brooks. My client has not been read his rights, has not had the chance to defend himself. These are accusations, not convictions." Elijah turned his gaze on him, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Your client spent 15 years denying rights to black defendants, sentencing them more harshly than their white counterparts, dismissing their objections, silencing their families. But unlike him, we will follow the law. He will have every right he denied others, but today his reign ends." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward again, reading Harrington his rights in the same monotone countless defendants had heard in his courtroom. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who had preached order was now being placed in handcuffs, his wrists bound by the very system he had corrupted. The bailiff, who only minutes earlier had been ready to escort Elijah away, now hesitated, his loyalty shifting as he looked at the badge in Elijah's hand and the agents at his side. When Elijah gave the order to keep the recording equipment running, the bailiff nodded in compliance, no longer seeing Harrington as the authority in the room. Harrington tried once more to protest, his voice cracking under the strain. "This is a witch hunt. I've kept this district safe. I've been tough on crime, firm on values. You're punishing me for doing my job." Elijah's response was a quiet thunder. "No, Harrington. We are punishing you for using the law as a weapon against black defendants, for twisting justice into prejudice, for treating families as enemies rather than citizens. You called it order. I call it corruption. And today, it ends." The marshals moved to the bench, their presence final and unshakable. Harrington's gavel lay on the floor, forgotten, as they pulled him from his chair. The image burned itself into the memory of everyone present, the once untouchable judge, pale and trembling, being led away in handcuffs while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Elijah remained at the center of it all, his calm presence commanding the room. He addressed the gallery one last time, his words carrying the weight of history. "Every case this man touched will be reviewed. Every defendant who suffered under his bias will have their sentence re-examined. Justice will not stop at his downfall. It will extend to those he harmed. Today is not just about one corrupt judge. Today is about proving that the system can correct itself when individuals have the courage to stand up." The crowd erupted in applause, a sound foreign to Harrington's courtroom, where silence had always been enforced. Now the walls shook with approval, with relief, with the sound of justice finally breaking through. Harrington was dragged out the side door, his last words a desperate whisper to Elijah as he passed. "I should have known you were too calm, too composed. Real defendants break." Elijah met his gaze steadily, his reply sharp as steel. "Real prosecutors don't break, Harrington. We build cases. And this one has ended yours." 6 months after Judge William Harrington was escorted out of his own courtroom in handcuffs, the sun streamed through the tall windows of the Attorney General's office, casting long golden stripes across the polished wood floors, and Elijah Brooks stood at his desk with a new nameplate that read, Deputy Attorney General, Civil Rights Division, a title that carried not only honor, but also the immense responsibility of ensuring that the injustice that had poisoned Harrington's courtroom for 15 years would never again go unchallenged. The man who once stood humiliated at the defendant's table, sentenced to 60 days in jail for a trivial violation, now stood at the pinnacle of his career, his reputation not ruined but strengthened, his resolve not broken but hardened. Justice had been served, but Elijah knew that justice was never a destination, only a journey, and the work was far from over. The fall of Harrington had sent ripples across the nation. His conviction on federal civil rights charges had become known as the Harrington Precedent, a landmark case cited in law schools, training programs, and judicial conferences. More importantly, it had inspired a new system of accountability called the Brooks Protocol, a methodical process of analyzing sentencing data, collecting courtroom recordings, and documenting patterns of bias. 17 states had adopted it within months, and federal courts were beginning to integrate it as well. What began with one black prosecutor risking his career to expose one corrupt judge had become a national movement to rebuild faith in the justice system. Elijah looked down at the files spread across his desk, hundreds of them, each representing a defendant whose case had been touched by Harrington's bias. So far, 43 had been resentenced, their convictions reduced or overturned entirely. Malik Jefferson, once condemned to 2 years in prison for a minor offense, was back in college, completing his degree, his record wiped clean. Marcus Williams, who had once spent 18 months in county jail while his white counterpart walked free, had received a gubernatorial pardon and was now studying law, inspired by Elijah's example. For each man and woman restored, there were hundreds more waiting, their futures still caught in the web of prejudice spun by Harrington, and Elijah felt the weight of those lives pressing against him, but he welcomed it. Responsibility was not a burden, but a calling. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Monica Rodriguez. Appeal denied. Harrington remains in federal custody. Justice stands. Elijah smiled grimly, knowing that the once arrogant judge now lived in the same prison where many of the men he had sentenced unjustly were serving time. The irony was thick, but Elijah did not linger on revenge. Retribution alone was empty. What mattered was the restoration of trust, the rebuilding of faith, The assurance to every black family who had once sat in Harrington's courtroom that their voices mattered, that the law could be bent back toward fairness if enough people had the courage to fight for it. The door to his office opened, and Sarah Lopez entered with a thick folder. "Boss, the Supreme Court just ruled on the Morrison case. Complete reversal, record expunged, language citing systematic bias." Elijah nodded, his satisfaction tempered by reality. "How many more pending?" Sarah's eyes flickered with exhaustion. 437, and more being identified every day. The statistical team says the pattern stretches all the way back to Harrington's first week on the bench. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, the number staggering, the damage incalculable, yet the challenge clear. "Then we keep going," he said softly. "One case at a time, one life at a time." Later that afternoon, Elijah recorded a video his staff had been urging him to release. Sitting behind his desk with the courthouse visible through the window behind him, he looked directly into the camera, his expression calm but resolute. "6 months ago," he began, "I walked into a courtroom as a defendant, not to seek leniency, but to prove that justice in that room had been poisoned. For 15 years, Judge William Harrington used his power to sentence black defendants more harshly than their white counterparts, to silence black attorneys, and to destroy faith in the system we all depend on. That day, I revealed my true identity as the state's lead prosecutor, and we exposed him. Today, he sits in prison. But this story was never just about one judge or one prosecutor. It was about the countless defendants who never had the resources to fight back, the families who watched justice twisted against them, the attorneys who whispered in hallways because they feared retaliation. It was about the truth that justice is only as strong as those willing to defend it." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "If this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice requires courage, then remember this: when institutions fail, individuals must rise. Justice is not blind. It requires our vigilance, our sacrifice, and our courage. Share this story. Speak out, stand firm, because silence is the ally of injustice, and today we choose to break that silence." When the recording ended, Elijah sat back, his eyes on the courthouse across the street where a new judge, Patricia Williams, a young black woman with impeccable credentials, now presided. Early reports spoke of fairness, balance, and respect returning to that room. Families who once trembled at the thought of entering those marble halls now walked in with hope, and Elijah knew that while Harrington's downfall was complete, the work of rebuilding trust would take years. Yet, as he watched the sunlight reflect off the courthouse windows, he felt a profound sense of purpose. On the shelf behind him, resting on a velvet cloth, lay the gavel Harrington had dropped that day in the courtroom, retrieved by a bailiff, and given to Elijah as a keepsake. He had not placed it in a case or mounted it on the wall. He left it cracked and scarred, a symbol more powerful in its brokenness than it could ever be whole. To Elijah, that broken gavel meant the end of one man's tyranny and the beginning of a new chapter where justice could no longer be taken for granted. As he closed his office for the evening and prepared to return home to his wife and children, he paused by the window once more. The courthouse stood tall, but no longer as a monument to prejudice. It now represented resilience, accountability, and change. Elijah whispered to himself, 15 years of injustice ended here. Tomorrow we build something better. The end. If this story kept you engaged until the end, I would love for you to support the channel by subscribing and giving it a like. It truly helps us keep bringing more powerful stories your way. Tell me in the comments what you think about the twists in this plot. Did Elijah's strategy surprise you? Do you believe justice like this can really happen? And let us know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing the community come together from different parts of the world.